The Durian Heat, bringing big ideas and critical opinions in Southeast Asia.
Hi, this is Arlene and you are listening to DurianASEAN, the voice of discovery and sharing. Together with me is Syed Nizamuddin, Syed Khassim. He's part of the Malaysian Youth Parliament as well as in the International Relations and Diplomacy Committee of that particular parliament, I would say. But today we are going to talk about something that is greater than the Malaysia Youth Parliament. We are talking about the ASEAN Youth Assembly. It is an idea that was mooted by the Youth Minister, Nizamuddin, and of course it's being driven by Malaysian youth. Currently it is being reviewed, right?
Yes, it has been approved by the cabinet, so we are pushing it through the
ASEAN level.
To ensure that this thing would be a reality.
Yeah, it's very interesting because when we talk about youth assembly on an ASEAN scale, there's not much avenue, or probably there's none at all. But my question about the ASEAN Youth Assembly, why Malaysia is seeing this as a significant platform for youth?
First and foremost, when we talk about ASEAN as a diplomatic platform, most of what we're looking at is a track one diplomacy, where most of the discussions are discussed at senior officials level, at ministerial level. But there's no avenue, if there are any, for the youths to speak out. Of course, there are other ASEAN youth programs, but these programs are rather individually driven by the private sector or by individual countries, but there's no concerted effort to include the youth's ideas and thoughts into ASEAN's policy as a whole. Other than that, we see that this should be an initiative which will benchmark Malaysia's chairmanship of ASEAN in 2015. So, as the Malaysian youth, we believe that this is our contribution to Malaysia within our chairmanship of ASEAN in 2015.
Interesting. But before we go further on ASEAN Youth Assembly, because I think it's a fresh idea, but it should have been implemented quite some time ago, I believe, especially in strengthening Malaysia's and also regional diplomacy among each of the countries within Southeast Asia. But before that, I'm curious about the Malaysian Youth Parliament. I know that in some of the countries within Southeast Asia, they do have their own youth parliament. But Malaysia also, we just started our own youth parliament. Maybe you can share some of your experience being part of the parliament and why it started in the first place.
The youth parliament started out of the idea that democracy needs the voices of youth. One of the hurdles towards an inclusive democracy is that the inclusion of youth is quite low, not just in Malaysia, not just in Asian countries, but also throughout the world. So several countries have been implementing youth parliaments in the UK, in Australia, because they realize that the voices of youth need to be heard by those at the top of the those at the top level of the country. So that's this realization. That realization came to Malaysia quite slow, quite late, but well, it's better than never at all. So that's when the Malaysian government started up with this Malaysian Youth Parliament. And in fact, before our first meeting, it took quite a while for the Ministry of Youth and Sports to come up with the formula, with the platform for the Malaysian Youth Parliament, parliamentarians to sit down and discuss on issues which affect youth and the nation as a whole.
So, how many people are in the Malaysian Youth Parliament right now?
There are 135 people. I can't remember how many of them were actually selected by the Ministry of Youth and Sports, because they were selected to be in to balance out the number of demographic balance. Those who are from the minorities, for example, ethnic minorities, those who are representing those with special needs, for example, they are practically handpicked by the Ministry of Youth and Sports to be in, so that their voices could be heard as well. Aside from those who are elected by the youths.
So there's a good balance between having a minority representatives as well
Yes.
as the ones that are being voted by the majority of youth in Malaysia.
Yes.
What is unique about the Malaysian Youth Parliament? In a way, is it inclusive enough? Because in Malaysia, it's so partisan. When it comes to our own politics, that to have an inclusive platform is actually quite rare.
Yes, I think that the Ministry of Youth and Sports, they tried to make it as inclusive as possible. I wouldn't say that the participation is a perfect reflection of the youths in Malaysia, but then again, they tried their best to promote Youth Parliament as an inclusive platform for the youths to speak and discuss about issues which are relevant to the youths. But I would say that more needs to be done. There are, of course, people among the youth parliamentarians. There are those from the opposition. There are those from the ethnic minorities. There are many voices within youth parliaments. Of course, it's not as reflective as how we would want it to be, but this is a start. This is a good start, I would say.
So what are the key issues that have been discussed or currently is being tabled at the Malaysia Youth Parliament?
I would say basically bread and butter.
So you guys talk.
Rising costs of living.
So you guys talk about socio-economic issues.
Socio-economic issues as well, and of course international relations.
But what about like sensitive topics like Sedition Act or the POTA Act? Is it being discussed on the youth level?
During the first session, POTA has yet to be discussed or tabled in the Parliament. So I am guessing that much of the issues regarding POTA and on the debt, on the country's debt, will be discussed during the next sitting. I have no doubt about that because we practically have vocal members within the Youth Parliament.
So in a way that you guys are not just inclusive in terms of members, but also inclusive in terms of issues.
Yes.
About international relations issues,
Exactly.
what are the key issues that Malaysia I guess, concerned on? The international relations issues that Malaysian youth are concerned?
When it comes to international relation issues, one of the issues being...
Don't tell me it's Palestine, right?
But to be honest with you, when it comes to international relations, not just the youth, but the whole public at large, there's this low awareness of what's going on around the world. Most of the perspective would be slanted by religious beliefs and things like that. So even when it comes to the real parliament itself, the discussion on international relations issues would be about Palestinian issues, would be about on the issues affecting the Arab world and things like that. But nothing much, no in-depth discussion on international relations like what they're discussing in the United States of America when they come to talk about the deal that they're having with Iran and their relationship with Israel.
So on the youth level, we don't really discuss much about what is our relationship with China, how it's supposed to be, or with the US, or with EU, or the kind of trade agreements that we sign, how effective it is.
In order for us to have that discussion, there needs to be a well-informed members who know about these issues. So when we have these well-informed members, only then we will be able to discuss on all these issues effectively. On, for example, like TPPA, for example, like China's activities in South China Sea, and several other issues affecting the global stage as we talk.
So it's still a long way in a sense.
It's still a long way to go. More needs to be done. We need more public diplomacy in order for us to explain to the public on what's going on in the international stage.
But what about on ASEAN matters? Has it been a platform for ASEAN Youth Parliament to talk about?
When it comes to ASEAN, unfortunately, Malaysia is one of those member states which have the lowest
How low is it?
Let's just say that really, really low when it comes to realizing what ASEAN is all about. So in order for us to make sure that people actually understand what ASEAN is all about, there needs to be more people-to-people diplomacy or track-to diplomacy, all right, so that people will realize how will ASEAN affect us, what is the effect of ASEAN community on our daily lives, right? Because so much has been talked about ASEAN, but these discussions were very much quarantined on top-level diplomacy or track one diplomacy, as we call it. So there's not much discussion between the peoples within Southeast Asia. So that discussion need to start, especially among the youths, because these people will eventually join in the workforce, be the future leaders, etc. And that needs to start now in order for a more inclusive ASEAN community to develop. But I would say that there's nothing much that you can talk on when there's not much realization among the grounds.
We'll take one short break. When we return, we will discuss more about the ASEAN Youth Assembly.
The Durian Heat, bringing big ideas and critical opinions in Southeast Asia.
Hi, this is Arlene. You're back with me again on our Durian Heat. And of course, you are still with Syed Nizamuddin, Syed Khassim. He is the International Relation and Diplomacy Committee, part of the Malaysian Youth Parliament. And of course, today we are continuing our discussion on the ASEAN Youth Assembly, an idea that started in Malaysia. And you early on, you share with us on why the ASEAN Youth Assembly is significant.
Yeah.
But I want to know, like, what is the process right now? Has it been accepted among the youth, ASEAN youth around Southeast Asia, or has it been just an idea that is known among the Malaysian youth?
The thing about ASEAN Youth Assembly, the idea has been accepted by the Malaysian government. Now, the current process where we're going with this is we're trying to bring this idea to the other ASEAN members. Now, when it comes to bringing in a new idea to the ASEAN fora, in ASEAN, it needs to go step by step. So the next step for us is to discuss on this ASEAN Youth Assembly among the senior officials within ASEAN. Now, when that has come to pass, the idea will be mooted and discussed among the ASEAN leaders in ASEAN. So practically, this will be a dreading process, I would say, but this has to be done in order for us to have a track to diplomacy within ASEAN, which we direly need in ASEAN.
Can you share with us, like, what do you mean exactly, the track 1 and track 2 diplomacy? Because how significant is, for example, ASEAN youth are able to do in terms of influencing the voices on top?
Now, before we talk about ASEAN, I'll explain a bit about track 1 and track 2 diplomacy. Track 1 diplomacy refers to the official diplomacy, the official channel between one Ministry of Foreign Affairs to another Ministry of Foreign Affairs, from one leader to another leader. The ASEAN Leaders Summit, the ASEAN Ministerial Summit, these are track 1 diplomacy, where people discuss things which are the official stance of the individual countries. Track 2 diplomacy, on the other hand, is an informal form of diplomacy. When you talk about track 2 diplomacy, you're talking about sporting events, for example. You're talking about where people are able to discuss about issues which are not be able to be discussed on or on track 1 diplomacy. When you look at the global stage, you could see that the starting point of China-US relationship, it goes back to track 2 diplomacy, ping-pong diplomacy. Without ping-pong diplomacy, there would not be a normalization of ties between China and the United States. The same could be said about the Iranian and the American track 2 diplomacy. Although the officials from both countries are not recognizing one another, they're practically against one another, but they need to discuss on certain things, and these things need to be discussed on track 2 diplomacy. That's where the idea to have this come up within the ASEAN context, where we have this track 2 diplomacy in ASEAN. There are things which need to be discussed among ASEAN members, but which are not discussed among the ASEAN members because these things are deemed too sensitive among the ASEAN members. So by having this track 2 diplomacy, this ASEAN Youth Assembly, at least we are able to go through this impasse within the ASEAN circle. For example, maybe certain issues like immigration, border crossing among the ASEAN countries, the sovereignty of the South China Sea, the overlapping territorial claims, for example, which are perhaps too sensitive to be discussed. Having this track 2 diplomacy would be able to serve as a platform to discuss on, to come up with new ideas, which perhaps could provide a solution to all of these problems. Not all of these problems, but at least some sort of solution, as what we can see from.
So better recommendation from the ground in a way as well.
Recommendations, because things are able to be discussed openly and frankly.
So when you say openly, is it truly openly? Because the idea of having a youth assembly, meaning that you are not just inculcating or having more inclusive participation from youth, but also the issues that are being discussed should be more inclusive.
I would say that the issues will be much more open as compared to the official ASEAN meetings that they have on the ministerial and leaders level, because when it comes to track 2 diplomacy, things are very much frank. I'm not able to look into the future, but I would say that much like the talks between in track 2 diplomacy between Iran and the United States, for example, things are able to be discussed freely in a context that is not being able to be discussed on the officials level. So there's this, at least you are able to see certain breakthrough, although minor, but that's more than something that could. So
even human rights violation, human rights issue should be able to be discussed freely within the context of the ASEAN Youth Assembly.
There's a chance for it to be discussed, although I would not be able to say what all of these countries want to discuss within this forum, but I would say that there's a chance for these issues to be discussed as compared on ministerial level.
So can you share with us what is the framework or the whole ASEAN Youth Assembly would look like?
The ASEAN Youth Assembly would be somehow modeled after the General Assembly in the United Nations, where you'll have this, where the decisions are consensus based, and these issues will be discussed and bring forward to the leaders meeting for them to discuss. Now, maybe there are certain things that these leaders do not want to confront heads on, so maybe these things could be discussed on, on the youth level, which they eventually have to face when the youth decided that, look, you have to face all these issues. We are not planning to have it modeled after the EU Parliament because of the sensitive
Can you share with us how the EU Parliament model is?
The EU Youth Parliament, the model is very much different because, first and foremost, EU is different from ASEAN because ASEAN is an association of Southeast Asian nation. It's an association where one of the core policies is the non-intervention policy, the NIP. So practically in Malaysia you have different sets of rules and regulations. In Singapore you have different, in Brunei you have different sets of rules and regulations. And whatever that is going on, for example in Brunei, Malaysia could not intervene, even if we perceive it as something against human rights, for example. As compared to EU is more than just an association of nations. It's a supra-sovereign entity where it's a tad bit like a super state, where they have these rules and regulations coordinated between all the member states. So you cannot compare the EU model to the ASEAN model. So when it comes to the ASEAN Youth Assembly, that nature of ASEAN needs to be reflected in there in order for this ASEAN Youth Assembly to be relevant and acceptable to all members.
So when it comes to the ASEAN Youth Assembly, I think when do you think would be the time where it will be launched or implemented, if things go on smoothly, of course?
If things go on smoothly, I would say that perhaps this year, perhaps the Prime Minister will announce it during the summit.
So in conjunction with Malaysia's chairmanship as well?
Yes, in conjunction with Malaysia's chairmanship and with the creation of the ASEAN community.
So with the launch, I would say the possible launch of the ASEAN Youth Assembly, what do you foresee the coming future of the significance of this assembly?
Well, it's difficult for me to speak on behalf of all the ASEAN youths because definitely the Malaysian youth will have different point of view than those in the Philippines. But I would say that this will provide a platform for the youths of these countries to speak on issues which the officials or the ministers refuse to talk about. Right? So this will provide a platform for them, a chance. I would not be able to say what kind of issues that they will talk about, but this platform would be much more freer, would be much more open than the current platform that we have in ASEAN, which is strictly track one diplomacy.
But since the kind of issues that is being discussed is non-binding, so if they were to give recommendation, how is it going? How are they able to influence the decision making on top?
Whatever decisions that the ASEAN Youth Assembly will decide to adopt in the future, even if those resolutions are not accepted on the leaders level, at least it will create a ripple effect, which by hook or by crook will affect the political dimension within ASEAN. So people will be able to see that, look, although this will not affect much, but it will affect a little. You know, how at least the leaders will take a step back and look, this may not be able, this is not sustainable, we have to change this policy, for an example. So they are able to look at it, take a step back and study the policies that they should be implemented.
I mean, the reason why I asked this, because a lot of the decision making are made during this ministerial rounds, and there are different categories of ministerial rounds. They are on education, on economy, and and etc. But the thing is, as part of the ASEAN Youth Assembly, like you know, some issues are overlapping, and some issues might be more significant than the other. How are you able to keep track and be able to directly channel the recommendations of youth towards these different ministers during the ministerial rounds itself?
I would say that the recommendations made by the youth during the ASEAN Youth Assembly later on in the future would have an impact which is rather cross-cutting. So in terms of channeling these issues raised by the youths, I would say that this will be fine-tuned during the senior officials level before it reaches the ministerial level, as what is going on when it comes to issues affecting ASEAN currently. So, but the important thing is ASEAN Youth Assembly will serve as a platform in order for what the youths are saying is heard by those in the ministerial level. Because as of now, whatever the youths are saying, there's no platform for them to voice that out. Now, when it comes to taking action for what the youths actually want say or actually stressed on, that's a different story altogether. That's a different ballgame. But at least this will raise up the voices of youth in ASEAN.
Anyway, we'll take another one short break. When we return, we will talk about the youth voices in the ASEAN level and what are the issues and challenges that they face.
The Durian Heat, bringing big ideas and critical opinions in Southeast Asia.
Hi, this is Arlene. You're back again with me and also Syed Nizamuddin on the topic regarding on the ASEAN Youth Assembly. So we discussed extensively on the ASEAN Youth Assembly, but let's focus on ASEAN Youth. of course, you are more aware on Malaysian youth because you work in Malaysian Youth Parliament. But when it comes to ASEAN youth, can you give us an overview? What is their thinking? What are their issues and all that?
When it comes to ASEAN youth, I would say that it's difficult for us to gauge ASEAN youth as a community per se, because number one, as compared to the European youth, our sense of belonging within ASEAN is very much low as compared to our sense of belonging within a country. And even that, the process of nation building within the countries in ASEAN is still ongoing. The process of nation building is still there as compared to all of these countries within EU. When you look back at the member countries within ASEAN, you're talking about post-colonial countries, which are practically very much created after the 1950s. So these countries, up until now, are still struggling with the process of nation building, identity building. What kind of country should we be? Even in Malaysia, we're still struggling with what is a Malaysian. In Singapore, they're still building that country. What entails it, or what actually is a Singaporean, or who is actually a Singaporean. In Indonesia, it's the same. In Philippines, it's the same. In Thailand, it's the same. So when we want to talk about ASEAN community as a whole, now that's a different ball game altogether. It's still relatively new, and we have yet to come up with a proper position of what being an ASEAN youth is all about. So there's still very much arguments about that. But what we can discuss is how ASEAN, we the ASEAN youth, could discuss about is how we as a new community will be able to work together in order for us to achieve something, or to strategize, or to position ourselves within the world stage in order for us to gain prominence. Alright? So that posturing needs to be there. Because that sense of posturing is, even among the leaders in ASEAN, is relatively low. When you take a look at our involvement in the G20, practically every chair of ASEAN is invited into the G20 as a guest. But our contribution, or our stance in the G20, is relatively unheard of. And our role within the G20 is practically dismissible. It's not there, it's not prominent. And something has to be done in order for us to have that prominence within the global arena. So that posturing needs to start from the youth to the leaders level. So at least on the youth, they could smoothen things out, discuss about things which the leaders or the senior officials would not discuss because of the sensitive issues. Then it's a starting point.
So what's the language that you'll be using for the ASEAN Youth Assembly?
The language that we'll be using will be English, similar to the...
But would it be any barriers? Because socio-economically, countries in Southeast Asia are not really similar in a way that you have developing countries that are doing very well, like Malaysia, Singapore, to some extent Indonesia, Thailand, and Brunei. But then countries that are still struggling economically, and the youth may not have the same kind of exposure. For example, countries within the CLMV countries or Indochina countries, how can they engage better with youth to the larger extent, all the youth in Southeast Asia?
When it comes to diplomacy, language has always been one of a barrier, but it can also be an opportunity. When you look at APEC, for example, the Asia Pacific Economic Conference, the working language is English, but that does not deter countries like Papua New Guinea to participate actively in it. So I would say that, of course, there's a certain barrier towards the participation towards these delegates to air their views. But I wouldn't see that having English as the working language would actually deter the networking or the participation of these countries. Yes, there's barrier, of course there's difficulty, but in the long run, I would say that these countries would eventually adapt and be able to participate actively and forcefully within the ASEAN Youth Assembly.
That's interesting, and I think it's good that English is, I guess, the binding language. Although I would suspect that some youth in some of the countries would struggle in a way, but in the sense that the platform itself, how can it be inclusive? Because when it comes to youth, probably in the Malaysian context, Malaysian youth might be more aware on the ASEAN Youth Assembly, but to the larger extent, how are you going to make it inclusive? Are you going to have elections, or are the governments going to appoint this youth? Because politically as well, different countries has different political structure.
Right. Now the thing about participation for the ASEAN Youth Assembly, we have yet to go into the details of all of this, but what we have in mind is something similar to Indonesia's approach in selecting their youths to participate in the G20 Forum for Youths. Now, when it comes to selecting their youth ambassadors, so-called, to participate in the G20 Youth Forum, they had an open application where the youth throughout Indonesia are able to send in their CVs to this body to be selected based on merit to represent the voices of youth in this international fora, the G20 Youth Forum. So I would say that for Malaysia, I would suggest for the same thing to happen, so that we would be able to have a forceful, a dynamic voice for Malaysian youth in the international fora.
Are you going to have like something like a ministerial round or ministerial meeting, but on the youth scale, or when it comes to the ASEAN Youth Assembly? Because in a way that how's the representative going to look like? Is it going to be like 5% per country, or is it going to be like divided into the executive and then the judiciary and the parliament?
Now, since the ASEAN Youth Assembly has yet to be discussed in details between the ASEAN members, I would say that different countries would perhaps come up with different proposals on the proportion of the youths represented within the ASEAN Youth Forum. So up until this has been finalized, there's nothing much that I can say, but or comment, because the other ASEAN countries have yet to air their views regarding the ASEAN Youth Assembly. So up until then, I would say we'll just wait and see how the counter proposals will come in later on.
Can you share with us some of the key issues that is happening right now that is impacting youth? Because I know in Myanmar, the youth are mobilizing themselves, protesting against the national education law that would affect the students in Myanmar. And of course in Malaysia, you have various issues impacting youth, and one of it, of course, in relation with the AUKU law. But if you can give us a general overview, like what are the key issues that are impacting youth?
General issues which are affecting youth, basically I would say that among the youths in ASEAN, there's no singular issue which is affecting this the whole ASEAN economic community. There's no single issue which they could actually rally around together and voice out their views on it. But I would say that when it comes to international relations in ASEAN, among our youths, one of the main concerns is the rising power of China and its influence within the ASEAN sphere. And that issue, that concern, is shared by those in Malaysia, Brunei, Indonesia, Philippines, and almost throughout the countries within ASEAN. This issue is not much discussed on. I mean, it tried to be pushed forward to be discussed by several countries, but several countries are against it. And because of the consensus within ASEAN, the sensitivities
surrounding
they would rather not talk about it. But I think having the ASEAN Youth Assembly, then we are able to talk about this, to have our views pushed forward, in order for the power that be to listen to the voices.
But then goes back to my question, like it seems like when it comes to youth, the topic that they are most comfortable talking about are issues relating to freedom of expression. That's why I give example of what is happening right now in Myanmar and of course in Malaysia. And besides freedom of expression is of course bread and butter issue like employment, education. But when it comes to international relation, it seems not to be directly impacting youth, and the kind of level of discourse to be able to address this issue. Are Southeast Asian youth equipped enough to discuss such high level or high thinking topics?
Again, I would say that I would not be able to talk on behalf of the whole ASEAN youth, but on within Malaysia itself, it's not just the youth. Even among our senior politicians, the discussion or the discourse on international relations are practically surface level. The discussion or the issues being discussed about, most of the times it's about the Palestinian issues when it comes to international relations. So much so that when it comes to parliamentary questions, most of the questions being forwarded to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs have always been about Palestinian conflict. What have we done what have we done for Gaza and things like that? But beyond that, what about the balancing of power between China and
the West?
The Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the AIIB. That's not very much. That's not discussed entirely. What about our position as a country, as a new country within this chessboard? I would say there's not much discourse on it, on what path that we should take, what strategic position that we should take.
Again, I think probably our strategic decision that we have made is about our stance on batik.
Even that, like I say, is very much surface on that.
Yeah, it's very surface.
There's not much discussion or discourse on international issues. That when every time when there's a discussion on international relations, it's very much restricted. Not because the government restricts it, but because the level of awareness amongst the public in Malaysia, not just the youth, but throughout the public, is low as compared to other countries like the United States, where they practically actively participated in the discussions regarding America's position in the world.
We'll take another one short break. When we return, we will talk about ASEAN integration and ASEAN community and how it would impact youth in the future.
The Durian Heat, bringing big ideas and critical opinions in Southeast Asia.
Hi, this is Arlene, and of course you are with me and Syed Nizamuddin again on the topic regarding on ASEAN Youth Assembly. So, regarding on ASEAN post 2015, probably we heard about it, but probably none of us have any clue what the hell it's all about. But the future of ASEAN will be seen as an ASEAN community. It's no longer about Malaysia alone or Indonesia alone. Everyone will be seen as a community. But to get towards ASEAN community, there's a whole lot of integration from social politics to social cultural to, of course, economic. I think the AAC is the one of the key driver for ASEAN community or ASEAN integration. But from your perspective, how would this, the whole discourse on ASEAN would impact youth in the future?
It's interesting that you mentioned about ASEAN post 2015, because ASEAN post 2015 is very closely related to the post 2015 development agenda, which is part and parcel of the United Nations plan for development throughout the world post 2015. It's a plan which is a continuity of the Millennium Development Goals, which has been discussed and talked about thoroughly, and the outcome has been discussed and debated about. In essence, post 2015 ASEAN, I would say, will have so much to do with regards to the youth in ASEAN today. Number one, because one of the important issues which is discussed about, which is talked about or deliberated about in the Millennium Development Goal in post-2015 is the development of youths. Because these people, they will not stay young forever. They will be leading the countries in the future. They need to have the skills. They need to have the knowledge to drive the future forward. And the question is, are we well equipped? So these issues affect youth directly, both directly and indirectly. Secondly, when you talk about post-2015 ASEAN, you talk about sustainable development. When you talk about sustainable development, that will affect the whole ecosystem in a post-2015 world. A sustainable development will ensure a sustainable ecosystem within ASEAN, thus affecting the socio-economic fabric within ASEAN. When this affects socio-economic fabric within ASEAN, that practically determines how the governance of ASEAN would look like in the future. If the sustainable development is a failure, we will bound to see conflict within ASEAN. Not major conflict, but small-scale conflict, like coup d'etat, for an example, and things like that. But when we have a sustainable development, the economic impact, the impact of economic crisis in the future will be able to be absorbed by this sustainable development plan. This will impact our youths in the future, the development of future youths, and so on and so forth. So I would say that post-2015 development is a rather big issue, and ASEAN has a role in it, especially when it comes to the development of youth in ASEAN.
So, do you foresee young people being more involved on a regional scale, not just in terms of being part of the ASEAN Youth Assembly, of course, but being part of the entire discourse of how the ASEAN community would look like, what is ASEAN identity, and how can we benefit from it as youth, or what are the challenges ahead?
I think, Arlene, back to our discussion before this interview, I would say that ASEAN Youth Assembly is just a small portion of the initiative which should be taken by the government or any other governments within ASEAN in order for us to have a much more inclusive ASEAN. Having said that, again, I would say that what's most important for ASEAN economic community to be a reality is to have a sense of community itself. You see, again, back to the issue of nation building within ASEAN, when these countries in itself, these countries individually, are going through the process of nation building, we are trying to create a community building among the ASEAN countries. So that's a challenge, because number one, we practically don't know each other. I mean, the youths in Myanmar have no idea about what the youths in Malaysia are doing, or their beliefs, etc., things like that. And even their sense of inferiority, superiority complex among the countries in ASEAN, so on and so forth. These are the challenges. So what should we do is to have not just one platform, but various platforms in which these youths are able to interact, to develop a sort of relationship for them to foster a sense of community within ASEAN, which is why I said earlier during this interview that there's a dire need to have a track to diplomacy within ASEAN so that the idea of ASEAN economic community will be able to be pushed forward. But so far, the idea of an ASEAN diplomacy has always been focused on track one, which I think needs to be rectified as soon as possible.
So what's the feedback by the Malaysian government upon agreeing or upon approving the ASEAN Youth Assembly? Because I think from the government's point of view, it's quite critical to know what they see how, or they foresee how ASEAN community and how youth participation in ASEAN community would be?
I would say that the Malaysian government is receptive of the idea of having the ASEAN Youth Assembly. But the question now is to sell the idea to the other ASEAN countries about the need for an ASEAN Youth Assembly.
What are the obstacles?
One of the obstacles is perhaps some of these countries would see that the ASEAN Youth Assembly is a form of a platform where it could perhaps erode the influence of the government on the youths. Political, I would say, would be the most significant hurdle in pushing this idea forward, because we have this non-intervention policy. We respect each other's boundary, but this will also create a hurdle, because certain countries may not be that receptive with this idea because they believe that this will erode their influence on youth. Perhaps their youths in their country should not speak as loud as the youths in other countries.
With that, thank you very much, Syed Nizamuddin. Thanks for sharing your view on the ASEAN Youth Assembly.
Thank you very much, Arlene.